of it with Roosevelt was the Federal Labor Relations Act, which in effect forced the workers into unions and gave the unions the upper hand over the industry so that they were able to raise wages so high it's unbelievable. The auto workers have been the kings and queens of industry for a long time. Well, why should auto workers working on an assembly line make a lot more than, say, a mechanic or a plumber or a carpenter? What's so inherently more onerous about working, on that, especially given that that's unskilled and carpentry and plumbing and electrical work is much more skilled? Then the answer is it's the government labor structure that we have, okay? So loans to the auto industry. Then all of a sudden Fannie and Freddie started to go down the tanks, right? And so what did the government do? The government nationalized them. I mean, Fannie and Freddie aren't private anymore. They're now part of the federal government. All the creditors got paid off or will get paid off. The people that probably should get left holding the bag, the common equity people are going to get left holding the bag probably. The preferreds aren't. Why not? Because they have a lot of community banks, small banks, who bought preferred stock in Fannie and Freddie, and the government would like to protect them to a certain extent, at least protect their capital. But more importantly, when we imported all these goods from China and Japan and didn't export as much, and we gave them greenbacks, and they took those greenbacks and bought securities in America. They bought some U.S. Treasury securities, but they also bought some Fannie and Freddie. And you can imagine what would happen if we told them, say, hey, we didn't tell you to buy into Fannie and Freddie. That was your idea. And why did they buy into Fannie and Freddie? Because Fannie and Freddie weren't the U.S. Treasury. They were seen as a little shade more riskier because the guarantee was only implicit that the Treasury would take up for them. So the yield on Fannie and Freddie, the spread between their yield and the Treasuries was very small, but it was there. And when you start talking about not just hundreds of millions, but hundreds of billions of dollars, a little tiny difference in yield, just a few basis points makes a lot of difference in total absolute cash. So the Chinese bought a lot of this stuff, and if we just said, well, we're letting Fannie and Freddie go under, the Chinese might say, yeah, you let them go under and we selling all these Treasury securities. How about that, buddy? So, so at any rate, Fannie and Freddie are now nationalized. Well, what does that mean? That means it's a socialist industry. Housing finance in the U.S. is now socialized for all intents and purposes. But since housing depends upon credit, very few people can go pay cash for a house. They have to borrow the money. Since the government now is going to control housing finance, it means it's going to control the housing industry. It's insane. It's insane. We socialized that part of the economy. That's a big, big part of the economy. The loans to the auto industry, you know the old expression, who pays the piper calls the tune. So that's not going to be nationalized, it doesn't look like. It's going to be fascicized, if that's the right way to pronounce it, okay? In other words, what's the difference, not in terms of politics, but in terms of economics, between a socialist government and a fascist government? Well, a socialist government owns the means of production. A fascist government allows the means of production to be in the hands of private companies, but then it gives orders to the private companies. So it controls the economy indirectly, whereas a socialist economy controls it directly. But in both cases, the economy is controlled by the government. So we're fast on the way to a fascist automobile industry, and we have now a socialist housing finance industry, which is going to mean a socialist, de facto socialist housing industry. Well, but that's not the end of it. Why not? Because remember, they passed that rescue package, which was going to be $700 billion. And what was the idea of the $700 billion? Oh, and you had to pass it right away. If you don't pass it, it's the end of the world. Well, first of all, they came out with a 3-page bill. Congress wouldn't pass it when they told them it was the end of the world. They managed to make it a few more days. Then they passed the bill, and all of a sudden the bill had grown from 3 pages to 450 plus pages. Do you know the multitude of sins that was buried in that 400 pages, that extra 450 pages? You know what Bismarck said? There's 2 things nobody should ever have to see being made: sausage and laws. Believe me, if you saw what was in that 400 pages and understood it, if you could read through the bureaucraties and understand it, you would get nauseous very quickly, okay? One of the great rip-offs in American history. But they said, got to pass it right away. You don't pass it, the economy's over, we dead, we over, we all die tomorrow if you don't pass the bill. So Congress passed the bill. Of course, they had to bribe a lot of congressmen to pass the bill, right? And one congressman, and you can see him on TV, even said they basically threatened that there would be martial law if Congress didn't pass the bill, not because the government would try and force them, but because if we didn't pass the bill, the economy would tank so quickly that there would be riots in the street, and they'd have to put the army out there to stop the riots, okay? That's what they said. Okay, so anyway, but what were they going to do with this $700 billion? Well, they were going to go out to the banks and the S&Ls and that kind of thing and say, and not just them, the investment banks too, and say, you got all this junk paper on your books, all these IOUs that people really can't pay and all that. Here, we'll buy them from you. We'll give you the money for them. But then somebody figured out that's no good. Why not? Because if you buy all that junk paper and they got dollars, it isn't going to do you any good unless they lend the dollars, and they're not going to lend the dollars. Why not? Because they're afraid to. Why are they afraid to? They're afraid to because on the one hand, their depositors might start running on the bank and want cash, and on the other hand, they're looking at the potential borrowers and saying, hey, I don't see anybody I think I really want to lend to under these circumstances. Even Charlie, who has a note here and has paid it faithfully every month, he's been in debt to us for years, every month pays it faithfully. Hey, the economy's going south. Charlie might lose his job. And much as he might want to pay us, he might not be able to pay us. So we really don't want to make those loans. So you have that. So they say, well, what will we do with this money? Well, what they did with the money was kind of what Hitler did at Munich. What did Hitler do at Munich? Well, Hitler had his troops ready to go on the Czech border to invade Czechoslovakia. And so Hitler tells the Czechs, you send somebody here to negotiate with me, but it has to be plenipotentiary powers, right? In other words, he has to have the authority to negotiate anything. And then Hitler puts down a piece of paper and says, this is what you're going to do, and you sign here, and if you don't, I'm sending the troops in. So I signed it. I think it wasn't Masaryk, it was Masaryk, it was Benish signed, okay? So anyway, so what did the Fed and the Treasury do? The Treasury, with Paulson sitting there, and Bernanke here, and Baer, that's the woman who heads up, see, so all the bad people in this aren't men, some of them are women. Baer is the woman who heads up the FDIC. You see, ladies, you're not getting away clean. So at any rate, Baer is sitting on one side and Bernanke's on the other, and they got all their accountants and CPAs behind them and all that kind of stuff, and lawyers and all that. And they sit these 9 guys down, the head of the 9 biggest banks in America, and they said, here, this is the deal. This is how much money we're giving you, and this is what you're giving us in return.